Well, it's a very sunny day. I'm going to try to clean this off a little bit. There we go. That's a little bit better. See the sun streaming in from up above in our skylight because it's high noon here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So, welcome everybody. I am going to be talking today about the social contract and the idea of it and whether it helps us out here in America. And we can talk about other places as well in using it as a key concept in political philosophy or ideas, all that sort of stuff. This is the first of a new set of discussion that I decided and kind of spur the moment and then pledged to start doing monthly as a result of thinking about the protests both here in Milwaukee and across the nation and around the world, and about policing and violence and where the different sides resided and sort of taking stands on contemporary political issues. I do want to try to use some of my expertise as somebody who studies and teaches philosophy, not to put everything into the proverbial ivory tower and above everybody else, but rather to maintain some rigor in the discussion and bring in some things that will be useful, hopefully, for other viewers, and about some of its classic formulations and how those differ from each other, and then we'll bring it to a focus on the present. And that's what I'm intending to do for upcoming episodes. I guess we could call them that, or discussions, however we want to frame it. And I do want to mention, too, before I jump in as well, that we're going to be having this topic as the focus for, if you don't already know about, the Wisdom for Life radio show that airs every Saturday at 4 p.m. Central Time. That's a radio show that I and my co-host Dan Hayes host here in Milwaukee. And we picked, in this case, the social contract and whether it's broken as our topic. So at 4 o'clock, you can tune in. You can hear it anywhere in the world if that's something of interest to you. We also post it later on in podcast form and video form as well. So let me jump into the notion of the social contract itself. If we think about it in really broad terms and we don't associate it with one particular philosopher, like, say, Thomas Hobbes, or some of its earlier proto-formulations, say in Plato's Credo, or as we find discussed when Epicurus turns to discussions about the nature of justice, what we're talking about here is a fundamental agreement. And it's always, you could say, fictitious. I mean, there could be some cases where people actually do sit down and hammer out some sort of arrangement and put it into writing. I mean, that's part of what happens when people have constitutions that are written constitutions, or when an organization might drop its bylaws or things like that. You could say that that's also a social contract. Of course, an organization is it's a group within the larger society, right? So it's not the society itself. And to live bound by a social contract in a very loose form is somewhat, of what is captured by talking about this is, we live in a society, right? When people point that out. And they want to say, okay, don't throw your litter on the ground because then it sucks for all the rest of us, and you're kind of taking your more than your fair share of public space or something along those lines, right? So we can understand social contract really, really broadly as this fuzzy but attractive concept that there's some basic fundamental norms that govern things, and we ought to follow them. Why? Because we, in some sense, agree to it. We, in some sense, assent to it. We freely, or perhaps less freely through coercion when we don't like what the social contract is saying, we buy into it is one way to think about it. And so, what does this include? Well, every social contract, in order to really have some viability, has to have some sort of moral structure to it. It can't just leave everything totally open and say, well, everybody's got different ideas of right and wrong. We're not going to take any stand on that whatsoever. It does have to say, for example, stealing, certain appropriations of property are wrong, or murder is wrong, and it also probably, if it's going to be effective, has to not just say what's wrong, it also has to say something about what's good and what's right as well. And that's where we get to things that are a bit more substantive. So we can talk about justice as not just, say, like a virtue that a single person has, but as a way of describing arrangements of relations between people or groups of people or generations or all sorts of other things as well, including the relations of human beings to as individuals to groups and to the governance or to the organs of government, as they're often called in older texts, what we would call, the executive authority. So there's that, and that brings us to the third part that has to be there for a social contract. It doesn't work if there isn't any sort of enforcement aid that out of hand, we need to fix things. Oh, it looks like, there we go. We had a little bit of network instability here. Might be something going on here in Milwaukee. Could be just the internet. So you have to have somebody who's actually enforcing the social contract. And, if you think about what the fundamental point of having a social contract is, one big aspect of it is to minimize and to regulate conflict and disagreement within the society. So, let's take a kind of silly example, something that, thank God, I've never actually had to live in, but I think some people may be familiar with from experience. Homeowners associations, right here in the United States, if you live in certain neighborhoods, they've formed these associations where they often can be quite prescriptive about what you can do, down to like what color you can paint your house or how long your grass has to be. Okay, well, people who move in there and buy into that, they're informed that there is a homeowners association. And if somebody wants to say, well, I didn't know about these regulations, or I never really agreed to all of that, I didn't read the fine print, or I didn't realize that the board was going to do this or that, you can say, well, buddy, you kind of agreed to it in becoming part of this. And that's the other side to the social contract. There has to be some sort of benefit to those who are being regulated by it. And within classic social contract theory, that's what we see in every case. There's always somebody there's always some way in which you're better off being under the social contract than not being under it. And so let's talk about one of the early thinkers, and I'm going to put aside what we might call proto-social contract thinkers like Plato and the Credo or Epicurus or anything like that, and just talk about somebody who was infamous in his time, Thomas Hobbes. So if you've ever read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is really, the book to read. I mean, if you're a Hobbes scholar, then you read other books like, the De Cive and all that, and that's all very nice. But the Leviathan, and just the first two books of it, because the third book and fourth book are all this crazy theology that Hobbes was trying to get people to buy into. Don't even bother with that stuff unless you're really, really interested in Hobbes' conception of God and its implications for political theology. In any case, Hobbes depicts us as living in this state of nature, right? Actually, not us, because he's writing to civilized people who are under some sort of social contract, but it's actually not a very well put together contract. And he says that in a state of nature, we're actually in a state of conflict, and it may not be conflict all the time. But he says, a state of peace where the war can always be awoken. Basically, we're at each other's throats and in danger of losing everything, not just our property, but our lives, our freedom, our those who matter to us, all of that sort of stuff. So in Hobbes's narrative, people get together and they realize this is not a good way to live. We need to have some sort of better way of doing things. And the way that he depicts it is again totally fictitious, but he pictures people, each of them reasoning out that there are certain laws of nature that we ought to follow. And the first law of nature is that when people are willing to give up some of their rights in order to avoid conflict, everybody should get together and form this agreement. Now, Hobbes is a big believer in what he calls the sovereign. And this is an aspect of the social contract. You have to have, as we said, some sort of executive, what Rousseau will call the magistrate, some sort of enforcement mechanism. For Hobbes, it's most efficient if it's a person, like, say, a king. I was writing this to support the British monarchy. And then you have all the people who work for them. And Hobbes goes so far as to say that not only does the king have to have a monopoly on force, or it could be a queen as well, and there can't be any private armies or anything like that. You also need to get rid of people bringing up doctrines that would in any way limit the power of the sovereign. So he criticizes Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and all those lawyers for making exceptions for themselves. And he says political power has to be absolute. Otherwise, you risk falling into war, because as soon as you have factions that can fight with each other, you've got real problems. So the social contract that Hobbes lays out, it is actually encapsulated in a whole bunch of what he calls laws of nature, right? And if you read through these, they're pretty reasonable, all the way down to like when somebody is trying to deal with conflict and is trying to parley with them. You don't shoot them, you don't kill them. But a lot of them have to do with other things that are more basic, and they can even be understood in a certain kind of, as some Hobbes scholars have said, a certain kind of virtue ethics. Describing what it is to be just, what it is to be forgiving, what it is to be grateful, all of those sorts of things, and to get along with other people. John Locke is the next really big thinker in social contract theory, and he's often counterpoised to Hobbes, and he is writing in response to Hobbes. What Locke brings to the table are a couple new points. One is the notion that the state of nature is not this bloody, terrible war that Hobbes was making it out to be. But rather just a more unpredictable sort of state where you can't rely on keeping things as well. It's not as well run. So you need some sort of society that's going to be governed by a social contract in order to have better outcomes for yourself and those you care about. And Locke also thinks that you're entitled, particularly when the executive is getting too oppressive, too tyrannical, according too much power to itself, you're entitled to overthrow them. And he frames it in terms of the legislative and the executive. But it was used, as a justification for the American Revolution. And Locke gets brought up in other cases as well. And then the third big theorist in the modern period is, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's got a whole book called The Social Contract. But he brings up the social contract as an idea earlier on in the discourse on the origins of inequality among men, right? And there's a different sort of story that Rousseau is telling that we don't need to go into too much detail about. Suffice it to say that we go from savagery, where we're basically cavemen and very unsocial, and we develop language and agriculture and stuff like that. We move to barbarism, where there are rules, but they're enforced mostly by local agencies, and they're custom bound and all that. And then we move finally to a more rational form of society with civilization and a social contract. And for Rousseau, social contracts are almost always screwed up, right? And so you got to kind of balance what he says in the book, The Social Contract, against the discourse on the origins of inequality and some of the other things. He notes that one of the problems with civilization is that there wind up being these great inequalities And sometimes there are inequalities, say, of virtue, meaning moral goodness or capacities and all that. But they very often end up being more pernicious inequalities, inequalities of wealth, inequalities of power, inequalities of social status, and people use their position to get more and more for themselves and screw everybody else underneath them. And you might say, well, why do people accept that? Well, Rousseau also points out that people who are in a hierarchy are often willing to accept a lower role in the hierarchy, provided there's somebody yet lower than them who they can exploit and screw over and all that. And so, what this ends up leading to is the social contract often being broken, and being broken, not like, so in Hobbes, right, what could break the social contract? People disagreeing about things and saying, I have the right to decide for myself, I have the right to go into a faction, I have the right to undermine, the society if it fits what I want. For Locke, it's more about the tyrannical, over oppressive larger government. For Rousseau, it's whoever's ruling, and not just ruling in terms of political power, but also in terms of wealth. So the economic stuff, they push too much. He's sort of like Machiavelli in that way. Machiavelli thought that the rich and the few are almost all, well. Looks like we're having another internet instability problem as well. There we go. We're reconnected. I don't know what's going on with the internet here, but it's now starting to storm. Let me see if I can adjust this light to get a little bit more better lighting. You notice we went from super sunny to super stormy. So now is a fitting place to move in to talking about the present, isn't it? Although I do want to talk about two other thinkers as well. And these are 20th century, late 20th century thinkers, John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. So John Rawls is known for his book, A Theory of Justice. And in it, he sets out something that's, basically a social contract theory. He has another imaginative thought experiment. He talks about us all going behind the veil of ignorance. So where we wouldn't know what sort of person we'd be in the society that we're planning out. And so we don't know whether we're going to be of one race or another, or if race is even going to matter. We don't know whether we're completely healthy or we're going to have chronic illness. We don't know whether we're going to have a ton of kids or no kids. We don't know any of these sorts of things. What gender we're going to be. We don't know about our, ethnic background, economic situation. We don't even know what we're going to be interested in. How would a reasonable person set up society so that they could buy into it? Well, Rawls argues that what we would do then is we would pick a society that's governed by two basic principles. One of which is that most things should be made equally available to people within that society. So there's equality of opportunity. You should make it as widespread as possible, and you should make access to basic goods as equal as possible as well. There is a justification for making differences, fundamental big differences sometimes, like a doctor earning more than, say, the custodian, and that would be that it works out not only for the benefit of everybody, but that especially that it works out for the benefit of the person who is worst off in the situation. So that's an attractive idea, and we can use that. Rawls thinks we can use that as a sort of guide to reforming our own society and making it more fair and equitable. The other person who I think we want to think about, who's not talking so much strictly about social contract, but does have something to contribute, is Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, still alive today, still contributing. Wow, can you hear that? That's the thunder, rain sheets coming down. And Habermas talks about working out basic norms in discourse with each other. And he says that everybody whose interests are potentially affected ought to be able to participate in the discussion. It doesn't mean that they necessarily can hold it all up, but they have to be taken into account. And I think this is a good way of thinking about, okay, if there's a problem with the social contract, how do we fix it? Because social contracts So here's one key idea to take from this. They shouldn't remain static. They, as we make moral progress, as we realize that we made mistakes in the past, and that things need to be fixed or redressed, or somebody's been left out. We're going to get to that in a moment. We need to be able to fix the social contract if we're going to have a social contract. And the reason I wanted to talk about social contract in the first place, and both for this and for the radio show airing later on today, is I saw this very compelling video having to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests over George Floyd that have now become daily occurrences in many of our major cities, including here in Milwaukee. And it was Kimberly Jones, and she was talking about what was going on. And it's a very short video. I'll put a link to it once this stream actually ends. You can just Google it easily. And one of the things that she was talking about a social contract. Trevor Noah, by the way, got another. Trevor Noah, by the way, is coming from South Africa, where they had to work out these issues as well, and it's still a work in progress too. He talks about there being a social contract that would say, for example, don't steal, right? And if you do steal and you're affecting somebody else's rights and their outcome and their livelihood, who knows what else you could actually be threatening their life. You steal their medication. Some sort of enforcement agency comes in, usually the cops, and says, we're going to arrest you. And then the justice system will say, make restitution, or here's how we fix this. And oftentimes it doesn't work out very nicely. It's kind of a messy situation and process. Now, Kimberly Jones said, why should we buy into that? We've been shut out from all of this stuff. And by we, she was talking about African Americans, but she could be talking about anybody who has been outside of the overriding social contract. It's a very important question. Why should we be able to tell everybody that they have to buy into it if they're not benefiting from it? And if we might go further, the current configuration of how power works and enforcement and rules falls much more heavily, arbitrarily, egregiously, unjustly on their shoulders than it does other people. So she was talking, for example, about the Football Hall of Fame, and she was saying, why the hell should we care if it gets burnt down? It's not ours. Why? You criticize people for burning down their neighborhood. They don't own their neighborhood. And she's not just talking about economic ownership. She's talking about something more basic, more fundamental here. So I think in the situation of protests and policing, one of the things that we can bring to the table is this notion that the social contract perhaps never was what it was cracked up to be. And we could talk about the work that Charles Mills has done and his book, the racial contract, and I think people might ask questions about that later on. That's quite useful. But we might also think about how, like in the case of America, and we can say this about many other places as well, the social contract at first was quite narrow. It didn't include women. They didn't have equal protection and equal benefits under how things were arranged. It certainly didn't include people of different races. In some cases, it didn't even include people who didn't own property. And so there's all these different ways in which the social contract has had to be modified because people were like, this is bullshit. I'm supposed to buy into this and follow these rules and accept the authority of these people that are trying to use power on me, but I don't get what I'm supposed to get out of this. You're treating me like crap. You let other people abuse me and exploit me. What the hell, right? And so, our response as a society, and I think it's the right response, has been to progressively widen the social contract. And, again, we don't actually have some sort of document that we drew up or anything like that, but this basic notion of a wider social contract has been going on for quite a while. And then there's oftentimes pushback. Oh, you're going to make everybody equal, and you're going to get rid of these ways that we've been doing things for a long time. And there's always some pushback, and there's some negotiation. Like William James says, when a new idea arrives on the scene, it doesn't just we don't go from A to B. We always go from something that's kind of a compromise between A and B, and we get a new truth out of it. And I think we can say something similar in terms of society. Now, why would Kimberly Jones be talking about a social contract, and why would that be useful in thinking about the current situation with the protests and policing and racism, and which can be understood in a lot of different ways, and we can go into that topic as well. Well, I think she's quite correct that in many cases, the social contract, if it's not broken, is certainly in terrible shape. And policing is one of those cases. So if you think about the way the social contract is supposed to work, you're supposed to have sort of basic norms that everybody's following. And the police are the ones who are routinely engaging not just in violence, but in discriminatory practices, in humiliation. Think about stop and frisk. Effectively, carrying out kind of a state of terror against some of the inhabitants of our society, and doing so on arbitrary characteristics. It's, if you think about race, which, by the way, is kind of a shaky notion anyway, if you start digging into it, especially the way that we do it here in America, but anywhere else as well. If you think about correlating that to what should go into policing, caring about, say, criminality or stuff like that, there isn't the connection that would warrant treating people differently, what we call profiling, right? Except in some pretty extreme cases, and those are so granular. It's not like a global thing, right? And so when we have this problem with policing, when the magistrate, the executive, is gone bad, and not just bad in the sense of having a few exceptions or a few bad apples, but systematically bad. I mean, bad apples rot the whole bunch, and this is part of the problem. We don't see cops turning other cops in, or when they do and report them, they suffer retaliation and they're taken out of the picture. We have a real problem with how executive authority in terms of policing is used here in America. It's a big central issue that we're going to have to do something about as time goes on, and I think this is kind of a moment for us to be focusing on these matters. So, all that said, is the social contract broken? Is there a set of defects in it? Can it be remedied? What do you do when you have a social contract that is no longer as functional as it ought to be, or it's become dysfunctional, right? The contract itself has become this oppressive thing. Well, that's where we get to looking at classical political philosophy. What would Thomas Hobbes say? Thomas Hobbes would say, you're stuck with it, buddy. Don't complain about it, because if you do, we're going to use force on you. You can see where the Thomas Hobbes approach leads to. Rousseau would say, burn it down, start a new one, but don't expect the new one to be great for too long, because you're going to have problems with that one as well. Rawls would invite us to think about how we might make it more fair, how we might retune it, how we might, if we put ourselves, if we think about our contemporary situation and think about how policing works, then think about what it would be like if you had a criminal record, and any place that you went, they were liable to run that and then treat you differently, because we incarcerate so many people here in the United States, right? Or think about if you were in particular neighborhoods in the way that we have them today, and you were African American, or just looked poor, or we could pick all these things. Is that something that you would actually pick? You'd be like, yeah, I'm cool with a society like that, because I might be that person I don't think so. I mean, Rawls correct about that. Habermas is much more interested in how do we actually carry out these discussions now? Who gets a seat at the table? And I think that's an important way of reintroducing the possibility of getting people to buy in. We need to make things more representative in terms of our national politics, in terms of our state politics, our cities, our communities, and those other units need to be listening to each other. I would say, instead of saying, "Screw those people over there who want to make things," they say it's better. We call it going backwards. Um, all you have to do is like go down the road from Milwaukee, where we have our problem. We are, there's a clear process of working on right now, to some of the other much more red counties that surround it, and you can. So that's pretty much all that I had to say. I talked for quite a long time. I don't see any questions or comments at this point. I'm not quite sure why. Usually I'm flooded with way too many, but I'll take whatever people have to bring to the table at this time and see what people have to say and what they want me to respond to, or what points they want to make. I know that we have a kind of worldwide audience, limited, of course, by viewing time. I'm sure it's midnight somewhere and people are in bed there. But is this notion of the social contract something that we want to keep? Is it something that remains useful for our political life, for thinking about the kind of society that we want to have, or is it too abstract? Maybe there is something to that. Maybe there's other concepts in political theory and philosophy and history that we should be relying on instead. That's a good question for all of you viewers. Where do you fit in on that idea? Is it something that you actually find useful? I mean, it can be sort of a trap when you're too strongly committed to the notion of a social contract. You get pissed off at everybody else for seemingly breaking it. When we get down to the granular level, where it's like, people in your apartment building, and don't they know that we shouldn't make noise at this time? Those inconsiderate people, right? So, I mean, social contract can sometimes be a problem. But again, that has to do with those enforcement mechanisms. Maybe part of what we have to do is not just get the norms right, but we also have to get all the other stuff right as well. Oh, actually, I can see there are a whole bunch of questions. When I did the pop out, this is kind of weird. I couldn't see any of that in the chat. It looks like I have to do it again. So let me try this pop out chat. Here we go. All right. So I was wondering where everybody was. All right, let's start taking things. So where's my eyebrow points out bees will murder their queen if she goes with the wrong mate. Yeah, okay, so I don't know that that's about social contract. I'm going to skip over the bee discussion. All right, Patrick Walters, what about Montesquieu? Yeah, I mean, Montesquieu is another important, early we're looking at him more in terms of the separation of powers, and then when people actually get into the spirit of the laws, and they, I mean, it is a head cracker of a book, right? That's Montesquieu. They'll often like focus on the issue of how virtue can be inculcated, and what different kinds of societies. Doing a lot of comparative work there as well. Let me put that back. Let's see here. Stacy asks, I don't know what's happening here, but there seems to be involvement of the natural world, like dolphins. I'm really a skeptic here, but something's happening. Not sure what that's referring to in terms of dolphins, but I mean, Presumably, if there is anything to this social contract thing, and it wasn't just tied to animals of the sort that we are, then once animals would reach a certain level of communication and organization and rationality, maybe they would develop social contracts of their own. Um, all right, Kevin Hornbuckle says, "Oops, forgot Marx." No, because Marx doesn't. Marx considers the social contract basically to be ideology. We're looking at people who actually have something productive to say about it. Stone Crows, with respect to the title, people should read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. So that's actually a good book to bring up, and that brings up a problem with the notion of social contract. When you have a society in which people are it's not just that they're individuated, right? It's possible to have people who are very individual, or say, race, or um, uh, residency, or things like that, or professional group. Then it's going to be hard to really do justice to anything like a social contract, I think. All right, William Ferraio, is Robert Nozick worth mentioning as a counterbalance to Rawls' perspective? I mean, here, probably not. I mean, Nozick, people don't know him. He's an interesting figure. The book to read would be Anarchy, State, Utopia, which not only goes into a lot of interesting things in political theory, but also, like ethical thought experiments and stuff like that. Having my intro class actually read about his experience machine thought thing. And but so Nozick is thinking that we make contracts, right? We make agreements with each other, but they're really bare bones. And does that work very well for late modern industrial society and very complex political systems and social systems and economic systems? I mean, libertarians would say that it does, but I mean, I don't think so myself. So, all right. Per person, there's no such thing as a social contract. Well, that could mean a lot of different things. None of the social contract theorists say that people actually sat down and wrote out a social contract in every case. And if that's all you mean, we can be in agreement. If you want to say that the idea has no merit, don't know what you're doing here. All right. Negro Cornelio, I have a problem with my teacher. He's saying Camus is not an existentialist. I'm saying he is. I'm saying I'm not understanding Camus. What can I do now? Well, as far as your teacher goes, you're screwed, because you're the student and he's the teacher. She's the teacher. But as far as truth goes, Camus is an existentialist. There's existentialism in what you might call it the broad, big picture sense, and then there's existentialism in much more narrowly restricted senses. Camus calls the people like Shestov, Jaspers, and Kierkegaard existentialists, right? And so when he's rejecting existentialism, he's rejecting that. He's also differing with Sartre, but he fits within the existentialist spectrum. Same thing goes for Heidegger. Same thing goes for Marcel. Your teacher just is being kind of a jerk. All right, let's see here. Stacy Washington, Rousseau is boring. Can't wait for a live AMA on Albert Camus. Well, you might wait a while for that, I think. It's too bad you find Rousseau boring. I find him fascinating. But, that could be a difference in temperament. Jordan says, I wonder, is a Foucauldian approach helpful at all right now? Giorgio Agamben has some interesting ideas. Agamben does indeed have some interesting ideas. He's sort of stepped in it lately in his response about coronavirus, and has earned himself much hate within the philosophosphere, you might say. I like to get my Foucault straight from Foucault. Foucault, so this is a much larger conversation. The idea of a social contract in any sort of strict sense, Foucault would reject, right? He's when he's talking about power, he says that power is not just about violence. It's not just about consent. It lies somewhere in the middle, and it's a free people. But the notion of the social contract, historically, Foucault talked about that quite a bit. It can be quite useful to make sense out of things. All right. Stuart Lindstrom, Juneteenth runs the risk of becoming just another brand with performative white allies, Juneteenth Day sales, and Black Lives Matter merchandise. What can we do to stop this inevitable occurrence? Keep doing the stuff that isn't that, you know? I mean, you can say the same thing about any movement, right? And then answer the same way. I mean, we can say the same thing about modern stoicism. People are like, oh, it's just become a self-help fad. Well, then quit reading the crap stuff and read the good stuff, you know, and actually practice it. I mean, this seems pretty straightforward. All right. Patrick Walters says, I think it's important to look to how the American social contract is dual. I'm not quite sure what that's going to mean. Jordan is co-op social movements, progressive or reactionary, depends on whoever will make the most money. That is quite true, and that is a factor of late capitalism, where that tendency, it's not as if it wasn't the case, say, back in the 60s, right? Think about the hippies and how quickly the counterculture became co-opted, right? It was in full swing by the 70s. But it happens in a much quicker way today, whereas people are pointing out swag becomes readily available, and you know, that doesn't have to detract from what's going on, though. I mean, you can that can be true, and it can also be true that there can be vibrant communities. I mean, think here in Milwaukee, we've had protests for now more than 2 weeks. They're coalescing into something. They're getting more organization. There's even like alternative protests going on with people who don't like the leadership of the main protests. And there's a lot of all sorts of nexuses of things going on as well. All right. Pergoni Andrea says, meanwhile, the elites support the revolt so they can annihilate the last of the white middle class. Yeah, I don't think so. That seems pretty far-fetched to me. That's assuming that the white middle class has a certain sort of homogeneity that it doesn't, and probably buying into some interesting narratives. All right, let's skip over some of these comments that are not particularly relevant. Jordan writes, profiling over sentencing for the same crime is rampant. Yeah, and this is a big problem here in America. We have great disparities in sentencing, and it's not just a problem in particular communities and their courts with, say, race, right? It's also a problem across communities. So, you know, we used to have an expression when I lived in Indiana, which was come on vacation, leave on parole, because Indiana would give people very long sentences for the same crime that might have gotten them half that time or a third that time in Kentucky or Michigan or Ohio or Illinois. And that's a real big problem. Another big problem is once it's discovered that sloppy police work or active malice on the part of prosecutors got somebody behind bars and they're proven to be innocent, like the Project Innocence Project, that doesn't actually get them out. There's a whole bunch of other things that have to be done, and there's never. I mean, sometimes there's civil cases, but there's almost never any real restitution for that sort of thing. People's lives are ruined by the way policing works, and it's really it's not only tragic. It creates a kind of resentment and righteous indignation at seeing the sort of things that the police get away with. All right, here's a silly question from Kevin Hornbuckle. Is Sadler going to morph into an SJW? So I think people who use the term SJW do so because they're sloppy thinkers, and it's. Am I going to morph into that? So I'm a virtue ethicist. I've been teaching philosophy, studying philosophy, teaching for 20 years, studying for 30 years. If Aristotle was around today, you probably would think Aristotle's an SJW just based on what he would say coming out of Nicomachean Ethics, book 5 on justice. And you could add that to that stuff that's in the politics as well. So I mean, if you think I'm morphing into an SJW, this channel probably isn't for you. All right. Kiss Booker says the police should be there to serve the people, not to repress them. That's exactly it. That is a fundamental problem. It's not just that the police are primarily interested in repressing people, although we do have way too many cops who are interested in policing so that they can be the big man or big woman with the badge and get to exercise power on people. We need to have way better screening, and the screening has to be continually done. And the bad apple cops, we need to get them the hell out of here, right? And they need to be prosecuted just as if they were any other. Oh, we got an unstable connection again. There we go. All right, we're back. I would say that policing is less simply about repressing people or humiliating people, and it's more about perpetuating its own structures. And that's not to say that there aren't cops who are in it for the right reason, but there are so many pressures on them to cut corners and do things the wrong way in the contemporary setting. So that is a really significant problem. We lost the pop-out chat when I lost the thing. Let's see what we got here. All right. Looks like I don't have all the chat, so let's pick up Jordan. SJW, a term used by reactionaries to disparage left-leaning arguments. It's not just reactionaries; it's sloppy thinkers of all sorts, and it's sort of like calling people snowflakes or things like that. It's a substitute for actually thinking things out. And when people use language like that, whether they're on the right or the left, they lose my respect, and that's an issue. All right, here's a question from Hetty Mental. Do I have an opinion on the potential for a third-party candidate this year, like libertarian candidate Joe Jorgensen versus Andrew Yang? I see almost no potential for a successful third-party bid, not just this year, but until we radically change things. And so this is where I, as an independent, somebody who can't actually identify with any of the available parties, but is willing to use my vote strategically. This is one reason why I'm so against gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, drawing these districts in weird ways, it doesn't just favor whichever party is gerrymandered, positively in that way. It also totally negates any effectiveness of third parties involved in it. So that's a big problem. The way that we set up elections really goes against third parties. We don't let them into debates, which is a problem with our media. So I don't see a third party really getting much traction at all this time around. And then they always get accused of being splitters and stuff like that. All right, Lenny Penny. How do we know if the differences in outcome between races is motivated by systematic racism? Asians have it better on lots of dimensions. Is this also systematic racism? Sure, it can be. I mean, systematic racism, or systemic racism, as we call it, is when there's different outcomes because of the way systems are set up. And, I suppose you can say the consolation for those who want to always talk about Asians. By the way, I saw a great podcast, or listened to a great podcast about why people shouldn't buy into that by one of the people that I follow on Twitter. How do you know if the difference between an outcome is motivated by it, or it's not motivated by it, but actually a product of it? Do the stats, follow through on the stuff. I mean, it's not that hard to do. All right. Let's skip over the stuff about social justice. I think we've said enough about that. Here's another boneheaded comment by Progoni. Systematic racism is code word for anti-white. Not helpful at all. All right. New card. I think the first thing people need to do is take a deep breath and calm down. Okay, what then? All right, let's see here. William asks, in the absence of a sufficient number of shared basic root values, Can the social contract be sustained? Depends on whose version of the social contract it is, right? Per person, the social contract theory has always been false. Okay, that's great that you could like announce that, and I guess we didn't have to have this at all, you know, or talk about these ideas. It's amazing that something that I've been like reading and teaching about for years and years, I could have like just not wasted my students' time with it. It's totally false. All right. Social contract is good as philosophy that we won't be able to adhere to. I don't know what a good as such philosophy means, but I think there's some usefulness to the notion of a social contract. And I'm not saying that it's useful in every condition or situation, or that we can read it into all the way that some of its proponents might have liked to do. But I think that it can be something that's useful, and people do refer to it. So I think we have to address it. All right, Kyo says, what might need to change for the court systems? Well, that's a great question. So I think that we should look very closely at how prosecution works, because before the people who are accused actually get into the court system as such and have their day in court, there's very often a lot of stuff going on between overworked public defenders and prosecutors who have all sorts of resources at their disposal and are incentivized to get as many convictions as possible, and will, quite often lie to the people who are they're engaging with, and get them to plea bargain things down, which then now a person has a criminal record, right? Which can be used against them the next time. I think we also need to start looking carefully at how judges are ruling, and make them more accountable. It's very tough to do because, as I've said in so many other places, here in America, we don't really have systems for things. Instead, what we have are all sorts of subsystems that kind of fit together in different places, right? All right. Robert says, it's the jails. For as long as they build jails, there'll be a problem. I mean, I think we're always going to need some prison and penal system. It's a question about how we're going to do it. And I think the ways in which we've made our prison system now is really quite really inequitable. There's some major problems with, I mean, I've taught in prisons. I see, at least in some degree, what goes on in quite a few of them. So, all right, I lost the chat again, so I may miss a few people. Let's see if we can get this back. Oh, Reed James says, seems like the social contract can become a tragedy of the commons. What incentive do average people have to uphold their end? Am I misunderstanding? So these are two different concepts, but they can be connected. And you can also bring in another thing, the free rider problem, right? So when you have a social contract and it's functioning fairly well, so that you don't have an awful lot of violations of it, and the violations can be dealt with well, and conflicts between people can be adjudicated, then yeah, you will have some people who take more advantage of it than others. Tragedy of the commons refers to things like, overfishing, for example, and it's when you have a a good that is being provided, or being, it's just there, accessible. You could say that it's been discovered, and each person takes what they want from it. Nobody actually owns it. They establish ownership of it by taking their bit, and then the incentive is, well, I need to get more than what that other guy is getting. So and then it pretty soon it's all gone. So that can happen with the social contract in terms of who gets what, but then that's a shitty social contract, and people are probably not going to stick with it all that long, right? And you're right. When people are not benefiting from the social contract, whatever it is, and they may not always use that term, social contract, then they will say I don't buy into this. This isn't doing any good for me, right? So, all right. Suvan says there's foreign class elements that have tried to take leadership of the protests and largely succeeded, that have only served the role of pacifying the demonstrators. I mean, that happened in Denver, I guess, but it's not happening here in Milwaukee, and it's not happening in a lot of other places. I don't know where you're getting that. Let's see here. New Card writes, social justice warrior is a specific type of person who talks about inconsequential social microaggressions rather than the serious economic problems of society. I guess if that's your definition of social justice warrior, there aren't that many out there, because there's plenty of other people who I think you would probably label as them, who are talking about serious economic problems. But yeah. And the man says, I think social contract is a bit privileged. I wouldn't know what to replace it with. I think that people who don't agree with the current social contract probably don't have the means to leave. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you mean by social contract as privileged. Privilege is something that we would apply to people, but I mean, I don't think that we have a single social contract in place. I think we have a whole set of connected things, and I don't think that the social contract adequately explains the entirety of society, or the political system or the economic system or something like that. But you're right. A lot of people are stuck in a situation, and this is one of the problems with social contract theory. The notion that, well, if you don't like it, you're free to leave. Free to leave where? Go. A lot of people can't even leave their particular town because they don't have the resources to do so. They can't change neighborhoods. They have a difficult time moving from one place to another. Even if they get the opportunities to do so, they may be quite unwelcome there, and people will make it quite clear to them. All right. Let's see here. William says, are some types of worldview sufficiently incompatible that they're not subsumable under one social contract? If so, is the U.S. approaching this difficulty? There's all sorts of world. I mean, this is Hobbes' point, right? He thought that almost everybody's other worldview was a problem, and so you get rid of them, right? Get rid of Aristotle and Cicero. Yeah, there's going to be plenty of points of view that generally are going to be one form of tribalism or another, and they prioritize their own group and their own way of looking at things, and say everybody else can kind of suck it, right? And if they get a chance to impose their own power, they will, and that leads to, as Hobbes pointed out, once you start doing that, you do have the problem of faction. A problem that, by the way, goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. They have some really great discussions of that as well. Is the USA approaching this difficulty? I would say that in some areas we are, and with some groups we are. And it's funny because, if you're on the right, it's the leftists who are the big problem with that, and Antifa and all that, crazy conspiracy theories about them, bringing in busloads of them. And I got to say that from effectively the center, motivated by virtue ethics, right now the right's looking pretty friggin' bad. I've had periods of my life where I've been much more critical of the left and its culture than the right, but right now I see bigger problems there. So yeah. All right. Mike Finney says dogs have a social contract when they meet and decide to play, and how to play and when to stop because one goes too far. I don't know that that's a social contract as such. I think you need more in order to have that. You can say that they have some, they seem to observe basic norms of behavior, but yeah, I don't know. All right. Let's see. George writes, an educated society is a just society. At least social engineering should focus on educating the people. That would be nice. Education is pretty low here in America in our K through 12, and even in our colleges and universities. I am not particularly impressed with the job that many of my academic peers are doing. Many of them who think they're doing a great job are, you walk into their classroom and you're like, holy crap, There was a great book years ago by Aram, and I'm forgetting the name of his co-author, called Academically Adrift. That's really worth reading because they use the best proxies that they could for figuring out whether better educated, to do with like the leftist professors or anything like that, and much more to do with the commodification, which by the way is run by neither left nor right, but business interests primarily, of education in America. So yeah, we've got some real problems. All right, Robert says, as long as they construct prison to resolve the issues of the lower class, there will continue to be this problem in society. That's part of it. I mean, we're not in a massive prison building phase. I'll give you an example again here in my home state. In the 1990s, we built a lot of prisons here in Wisconsin, and they haven't built a lot of new ones since then because they've got plenty there. But once you've got prisons, there's a natural tendency to want to find ways to keep those prisons filled. And so prison reform is often a tough sell. All right. New card says, if anything, we need a more tolerant, skeptical perspective. As Montaigne said, it makes no sense to think our beliefs are so true that we would burn others at the stake in order to defend them. Yeah, I mean, you can actually have some very strong beliefs and also think that maybe other people ought to be allowed to talk, and that we don't have to burn them. I don't think that you have to be skeptical in order to do that. All right. Alfredo asks, what could be mentioned about freedom of speech? Was Voltaire right? I disagree with you, but I'll fight for your right to say what you think. It seems many people get angry when people disagree. That's quite true. And there's a lot of, I mentioned the word tribalism. There's a lot of tribalism right now in terms of people lining up. We can also call it factionalism as well. We are probably more divided at this point in time than we have been across the culture for quite a while. And that's a problem. And a good bit of that is not just due to like social forces, it's due to individual failings. There's a lot of vicious people out there in terms of their ability to entertain two thoughts that might be different at the same time, and not get caught up in narratives of those are the devil and I'm the good guy, or these are my protectors and they're the good guys, or something like that. So that, and people do get angry when disagreements arise over moral issues. Plato noted that in the Gorgias and the Credo and the Euthyphro, and well, not in the Credo, sorry, in the Euthyphro, and in a few in other places as well, like the Republic. So this is not a new dynamic. It's been exacerbated, I'd say, by social media and the 24-hour news cycle and stuff like that, and the essentially commodification of outrage that's gone on as well. But going back to your other thing, what could be said about freedom of speech? I mean, the social contract, to come back to that basic issue, right, should allow for some freedom of speech. It should allow for people to exchange ideas. If it doesn't, then, I mean, and Hobbes was willing to countenance at least some freedom of speech. Just you can't like undermine the government, or teach moral or religious theories that would have implications that the government's doing the wrong thing. But I think most social contract theories would have to say we want a pretty wide freedom of speech, right? You think about Rawls's point of view. Would you want a society where you can't express yourself or not? All right. All right, let's see here. Lazarek says, is what happens in U.S. related to what happens in the world with the rise of authoritarianism? How do you see relations between what happens in the U.S. with what happens in Arab revolutions and the role of social media? So two interesting questions there. Yeah, authoritarianism is on the rise. And there's a lot of people when they did like psychological profiles of Trump voters, and you got to be kind of careful with this stuff, these generalizations, But it was really interesting that they found that the thing that did unite them together was authoritarian attitudes. And you look at the fact that he's managed, despite being, base, right, of people who will say that he's right no matter what. Um, and that is probably driven by authoritarianism, and there's psychological needs, and you could talk about, well, what's prompting that. Well, probably the erosion of fairly settled ways of life, the fact of massive inequality growing between rich and everybody else, whether it's middle class or poor, um, or even like upper middle class, right? The distance between them and the people who actually call the shots is immense. Um, the internet has in fact been kind of an unsettling thing as well. It's allowed all sorts of cool stuff to happen, but it's also allowed all sorts of new networks to develop. Um, and you look at if you look at the world. So let me back up a little bit. If you think about like the optimism in the '90s, right? And Fukuyama's often made fun of end of history thesis that we're going to just get more and more liberal democratic and stuff like that, and there's really not going to be any viable opposition to that. Okay, that was kind of nonsense when it was proposed, but a lot of people didn't catch that. And there's a tendency for people to think, oh, things are going to get better and better and better. Um, well, there's nothing that says that liberal democracy has to automatically succeed. Liberal democracy, in the sense of like a basic consensus about rule of law, leaving power when you're actually kicked out, instead of like leaving poison pills behind, a certain fairness in how you engage your opponents and stuff like that, all those sorts of things, universal franchise, all those sorts of things, right? Um, there's nothing that says that has to be the case. Think about the 1920s and 30s, right? Liberal democracies, oftentimes without great, long established roots, were just falling and falling and falling and falling. By the time that Poland was invaded, Poland wasn't a democracy. Poland was a military dictatorship, and it was being invaded by two other, a fascist and a communist power. Not to say that made it okay or anything like that, but all of these things, liberal democracy. If you read like the political theory books of the 1920s to 40s, which I used to do back when I was a grad student, and I was interested in like seeing what people thought at that time. Liberal democracy was only one option among a number of them. And if you think about the world that we're in today, many of the great powers, how democratic are they? India is still a democracy, and the BJP is on the retreat. I don't know that the Congress Party has really that much to offer. The reason why the BJP was able to supplant them was the years and years of corruption of the Congress Party. And look at China, think about Brazil. I was thinking the other day about how we used to talk about BRIC, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. These big countries. Well, they're all essentially now run by authoritarian governance, right? These massive, important, developing countries that we talked about in the '90s. Now, the Arab Spring thing is kind of interesting. Are the protests that are going on, is there something like the Arab Spring in terms of what the social media was able to do? I would say yes. There is probably nothing that has been more galvanizing for people who are on the left and in the center, and even some of the people on the right, than seeing video after video after video, just straight footage of cops abusing their authority, attacking people, engaging in barbaric behavior that's unjustifiable, and knowing that if it wasn't for that video, they'd be totally getting away with it. And they're still getting away with it in most of those cases. That made a huge impression. That, I think we're seeing a sea change right now, at least with respect to race and issues like that. Um, um, All right, Lyndon asks, I wonder, are the implicit and formal psychological contracts and expectations an issue by the same way that a formal law can be toothless without buy-in on a day-to-day level? Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it works until it doesn't, and then what do, right? You think that, and this is where a lot of people who don't, they're not used to having the cops involved, and they're used to just like going over to deal with their neighbors, sort of like face to face, and everything going along hunky dory. When they get into tougher situations, they're like, I don't know what to do, and then they immediately call the cops, right? So, all right. Ken Blackwell, did the police in the U.S. operate theoretically or otherwise under the concept of policing by consent? It's interesting that the police in many other countries are called police and not law enforcement. I mean, we use the word law enforcement and law enforcement officer, LEO, pretty synonymously. And I'm not sure what you mean by policing by consent. We have these things called consent decrees, but they're often not particularly effective. But I'll say this in a general way. When the police don't actually get buy-in from the community, they lose their legitimacy, and they can do so by behaving in bad ways and then reinforcing that by taking their own side and not punishing their own, not policing their own, as we often say, right? So that's an issue. Stacy says, speak about the social contract and traditional philosophical views, including Locke's views on slavery. I invite a lot of black friends to your chat to learn and become interested in philosophy. Well, thanks for inviting friends. I mean, Locke's views on slavery were not particularly enlightened, we should say, right? And this is a big problem for most of the thinkers. There's actually a really great thing out there in 1,000-word philosophy. It's a short piece about how we ought to approach philosophers who have taken what we consider to be, wrong-headed and morally repugnant positions. I mean, Locke was not somebody that we want to look to, not just in terms of slavery, but also in terms of the Native Americans here in the Americas and other indigenous peoples who he considered to be unreasonable. And I mean, I don't know that there's that much more to say about that. We don't want to. There's like no intrinsic connection between that, I would say, and the social contract as such. Although, this is where we can talk about Mills and the racial contract, right? Mills says that the notion of the social contract is essentially something that was just for white, and he's willing to call them tribes, which I think is actually a good rhetorical move. And that once race was used, people were considered to not be human, or if they're human, they're sort of like Aristotle and sold tools, right? And I think that he's right about that. I think that that's part of why we have much of the roots of the systematic racism that we still do have in our society. And the question is whether we can suitably expand, whether you want to call it the social contract or, the community in which we have some sort of reciprocity and justice and equity and accountability to each other, whatever construct you want to use to make sense of this, we have to figure out how we're going to incorporate people who have been systematically excluded, marginalized, left out, abused, exploited, all these sorts of things. And again, I would say that from a basic perspective of justice, and you can call it social justice if you want. By the way, first people who use social justice, people like John Stuart Mill, and the Catholic Church, right? And it's to talk about things that got left out that needed to be addressed as society developed. But I think if you look at classic treatments of justice, they would say that the African American community has been done wrong. Also, all right. Call me Shibboleth. How does one become bound by the social contract without consent? Is the consent implied? Yes, that's typically how it's done. And that is probably part of it where people will be like, hey, I never agreed to this crap. How are you imposing this upon me? And that goes all the way back to Plato's Credo, right? And the argument that the laws they're making with Socrates, some people view that as, I wonder if I've got that book up here, involving a conception of the social contract. And I think I gave that book away. There's a guy wrote a book just on that particular topic. Locke talks about a tacit and voluntary consent to not just a social contract, but to inequalities of different sorts. And yeah, this is a problem. And I think every so often you could say that, like, Hobbes thinks that once you give your consent, it's gone. You can't ever get it back. I think it probably needs to be reworked over and over and over again. And we have to have discussions about this sort of thing. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to try to find some new people. Well, this is a good point by Lyndon Bailey, going back to the video stuff. The tone, tenor, and demeanor of the bad cops you see on videos makes them appear like an invading army rather than a police force. I wonder also effects on things after 9/11, militarization, fear, etc. Yeah, I mean, that, again, that is very telling. You know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. How much is a video worth? Where you can actually see somebody behaving in these barbaric ways to the people that they're supposed to be taking care of and protecting. People who are supposed to be in their same community. A lot of times they're not in the same community, of course, right? All right. Lazarick Maji, what's the difference between American social contract and European ones? Is the social contract always written, or can it be not? What's the main structure? So the social contract is not the same thing necessarily as a constitution, right? But you could see it as kind of overlapping, but it might include other things. And you know, sometimes, you know, if we're using the social contract in a very general way to talk about moral norms that everybody's expected to observe, although often they don't, or they're, you know, broken, and then they have to be, you know, restored in some way. Americans are going to be different than French, are going to be different than Brits, right? But different French people are going to be quite different as well. I mean, you think about the Gilets jaunes, right? The Yellow Vest movement. In part, they're kind of saying, hey, our social contract is ruptured, and you Parisians and elites have made things great for yourself and said, screw everybody else in Lyon and Toulouse and the rest of the parts of the country, right? And America is a very diverse nation in terms of our social communities as well, the states, the local communities, and all of that. All right. Jacob asks, in terms of the American social contract, are all parties equal? Do all stand in the same relation to the contract? This seems the root problem. That's a good way to put it. So in the classic way of understanding the social contract, everybody is supposed to be equal except for the one who's not equal. So like in Hobbes, the sovereign has more power, right? Or the magistrate in Rousseau. But everybody else is supposed to be on the same level. They could have different things in terms of wealth, right? There's oftentimes a lot of room for that. And, you know, we got to protect that property in that case. And that can subvert the social contract because other things can be lost, other values can be lost in the process. Aristotle points this problem out without talking about social contract, by the way, in the Politics. I think it's not in book 5, it's in, oh no, it is in book 5, the book on stasis, right? Where it's also in book 2 as well, where he talks about the rich who are the few and the many who are the free, and how each of them manages to get justice part right and also get justice part wrong, and who's the counterbalance to them. We discover in book 5 and book 7, the virtuous, the people who actually aren't simply or political interests or something like that, actually give shit about their society and want to behave like these you know, these sorts of divisions. All right. Let's see here. Let's skip down a bit. Oh, it just jumped a bit. A lot of comments here, and we're getting close to the end. Mark Hofling says, thanks for the Q&A. You're quite welcome, and we'll be doing more of these monthly. All right, trying to scroll up to get to where we were. All right. Stewart says, capitalism has never not been racist in America, from the plantation of white flight and redlining after the world wars to the disproportionate amount of African Americans in Vietnam. Yeah, okay, there's definitely something there. I wouldn't say that every single practice or instance of capitalism has automatically been racist, but I suppose you could say, insofar as it comprises something like a system. I think it's better understood as a whole bunch of connecting systems. Yeah, you're right. I mean, redlining has made Milwaukee what it is, where we have this we are one of the most segregated large cities in the United States, and it has its effects on education and on policing and on the criminal justice system and hospitals and all sorts of other things, job opportunities, and redlining was an important part of that, right? So yeah, we can talk about a lot of these things. Let's see here. Brenda says Dr. Sadler is politically naive if he thinks politics isn't war by other means. Well, good for you, Brenda. I'm sure that must be great when you engage with other people politically. I think there's probably more to politics than war by other means. You might want to read Aristotle's Politics and see if there's anything in there. By the way, you'll get to a discussion about the people who turned everything into war in Book 8 with the Spartans, who Aristotle thought were kind of fuck-ups. So, all right. Bradford, do you think destruction of property is an effective tool for bringing social progress? Probably not, but that's not all that's going on. So, I don't see how I think that's kind of a red herring there. All right. Let's see. I'm going to scroll down a bit to see if I can find some other people who haven't put like 20 comments in here already. Yeah, no, here's a good point by CCAS07. Good point in one sense and bad point in another sense. The Democrats have created this mess since then. They've been running the large urban areas for the last 50 years. They use the judicial system as a way to tax the poor with court fees and fines. So if you had changed it to some Democrats have created the mess, then your statement would be true. The Democrats is not. Because some of the Democrats are those very poor who are getting screwed on all that stuff, right? And oftentimes they try to vote in people who will get some Democrats out. Right now, there's a lot of animus against our Democratic mayor, and maybe he'll face a challenge from the left. But I wouldn't say the Democrats, because that's not quite correct. Let's see here. Oh, that's funny. Life of Brian asked Brenda if she's moderating. I'm moderating. I'm probably not doing a very good job of it here. Life of Brian says it's the academic left wing that's fringe. It has assumed power and obliterated dissent, but it's a self-referential bubble of fatuousness. Well, that's some nice rhetoric there. It's always so funny to see these people who like have this like totalizing view of the academy and the left. They ought to spend some time in actual colleges. I mean, if you think that professors are indoctrinating their students, spend a while with professors in a classroom and see how hard it is to get just students to pay attention, and that you can point to. There's 100 Marquette universities where all the discussion about social justice doesn't mean anything, where it's business as usual, and where they don't even want to let the grad students have a union or anything like that. So there's this notion that somehow the academy has been taken over by the left. I got to call bullshit on that as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the academy. And if they did, then you'd probably see me fighting the left. So the fact that I'm not is probably a sign. Patrick asks, where can we find the radio program? So River West Radio, it's called the Wisdom for Life show, and it airs 4 p.m. Central on Saturdays. My co-host Dan Hayes and I are going to be talking about the notion of the social contract and whether it's broken or not. And you just go to River West Radio, you write riverwestradio.com into your search engine, and it'll come up, and you can click on the listen live if you want to. All right, Brenda has a good one here. This is coming from MLK. Do I agree those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable? It's good. Again, it's good rhetoric. I don't think that it becomes inevitable. You can so break a people's spirit that they can't revolt at all. But that's such a losing strategy for the people who want to have power, and want to actually be given, what Hegel called recognition. I mean, Hegel's master-slave dialectic gets way, way, way overblown. That's not all there is to Hegel. It's not Hegel's central notion or anything like that. But he is right about, and the interpreters of it are right about one thing. One thing the masters want is recognition, honor, kennen. They want to be viewed not just as having power, but that power being legitimate. And coming back to the MLK quote, right? Those who make peaceful revolution impossible, those who stand in the way of needed changes, they're going to screw things up, and sooner or later they're going to lose their positions because other people are going to be like, well, this is bullshit, and we need to revolt. Here's an interesting question from Diogenes. Do I think that large cities like New York are going to revert back to the crime rates they had in the 70s? And that is a serious question. I mean, we did have there was a reason why people could run on a law and order and, rehabilitation isn't working kind of platform, and let's build more prisons platform after the 70s, because crime rates were pretty high and New York was out of control. Do I think we're going to see that? No, I don't. I think that we're in a different kind of position now. I think we may see, quite a bit of violence, though, in terms of effectively, homegrown terrorism. So, all right. Let's see here. So here's an interesting thing. Call me Shibboleth. What notion of human nature does underlie the concept of the social contract in the first place? Multiple ones. I mean, Hobbes's vision of human nature is very stark, and it's quite different than that of Locke or Rousseau or so many other thinkers like, John Stuart Mill later on. So that's actually a good question. And you could say, well, the understanding of human nature you have is going to kind of drive the way that you see the social contract, right? Let's see. Trying to find something that's not back and forth that I can actually get in here and say something about. Something good to see here. Oh, here's a question that Latsa Daka. Has Sadler espoused any particular position on tearing down statues, degree of veneration of statues, potential for presentism? I have indeed, and I did so in a podcast that I did with Tom Ritchie, the Tom Ritchie podcast. I think it was about a year or two ago, and we're talking about Confederate statues in particular. And it was interesting because Tom is a fairly conservative, AP history teacher from the South, and you know, he's got a different view on the statues than I do. My view is get rid of all of them, because I'm actually, I'm a northerner, and I'm from Wisconsin. My family got here in the Civil War because my ancestor, my great great grandfather, crossed the border to be a hire soldier in the Vermont, troops that were being sent. So we got here by killing rebels, and Wisconsin actually threatened to secede from the Union if Lincoln wasn't elected, and contributed more than their fair share of troops to fight the rebels. And so I think Reconstruction should have been carried out in a ruthless way, and the rights of African Americans should have been enshrined and respected instead of allowed to be trampled on by white Southerners who wanted to reinstate a racist regime. So I think we should get rid of all the Confederate statues. I think that the Confederate flag should be burned in every case. Every instance of it should be gotten rid of, just as we would do with Nazi stuff. So people are going to find me pretty extreme on that. Some of my favorite Civil War statues, in fact, show Union troops trampling over the bodies of Confederate rebels who they've killed. So we shouldn't get rid of all the statues, like the one on Wisconsin Avenue. Let's put pictures of those. Now, do we learn any history from statues? Very few people do. I mean, this whole thing is kind of a red herring and kind of a silly thing to talk about. And do we get much out of like destroying statues? Temporarily, we do. And in the long run, well, there's something in saying, well, we finally are starting to address these things. Now let's move forward on more important things as well. So yeah. That's probably a good thing to go out on. If you want to find the thing, it's the Tom Ritchie podcast. Just type it into Google and maybe add the search term Sadler, and you can hear that podcast where he and I are going back and forth about that. Radio show on the social contract, as I mentioned, River West Radio. The show's called Wisdom for Life. So thanks for all the questions and comments. I didn't get to all of them, and never do, but we're already a little bit over time, and I've got to get to putting together some class content for a class that starts on Monday. So I'll see all of you, and yeah, we'll take a look at some of the comments that I didn't get to as I go through the chat.